India once held a quarter of the world's wealth, yet today it struggles with poverty. What happened? Over centuries, Britain drained trillions in gold, grain, and resources, financing wars, palaces, and empire. Famines killed millions while vaults in London overflowed. What happens when one nation's golden age is built on another's destruction? India once held 25% of the world's wealth. So how did it become one of the poorest? 200 years ago, India wasn't a land of poverty. It was the world's golden hub. By 1700, India controlled nearly 25% of global GDP, exporting fine cotton, spices, diamonds, and gold. The Mughal treasury sparkled with reserves larger than many European nations combined. Cities like Surat and Dhaka bustled with merchants who spoke Persian, Portuguese, Dutch, and Arabic, trading in one of the most valuable currencies of its time, the silver rupee. Yet by 1947, the year Britain finally left, India's share of the world economy had collapsed to under 4%. How does a nation fall from unimaginable wealth to crippling poverty in just 2 centuries? The answer hides in policies deliberately designed to drain wealth from one side of the empire to fuel the other. Dadabhai Naoroji, India's first major economic thinker, called it the drain of wealth. He calculated in the 19th century that India was losing hundreds of millions annually through unfair taxation, skewed trade, and the forced export of precious metals. This wasn't conquest through guns. It was conquest through accounts, contracts, and shipping manifests. The scale shocks even today. Recent research by economist Utsa Patnaik estimates Britain extracted the modern equivalent of $45 trillion from India between 1765 and 1938. That's more than the GDP of the United States and China combined today. So why don't we hear about this theft as much as battles and wars? Because wealth drained invisibly leaves no monuments, no ruins, only the quiet devastation of villages, empty markets, and silent hunger. And that hunger, sometimes engineered, would leave scars deeper than the gold itself. But to understand how the robbery began, we need to look at who the robbers were. A trading company built the world's largest private army. But was it business or invasion? It starts with a company, not a government, not a crown. The East India Company, formed in 1600 by Queen Elizabeth I's charter, was simply meant to trade spices. Yet by the mid-17th century, it commanded an army of 260,000 soldiers, twice the size of Britain's standing military. Imagine a corporation today with a private army larger than the Pentagon's forces. How did traders transform into rulers? At the Battle of Plassey in 1757, company officer Robert Clive defeated Bengal's Nawab with an army funded by Indian financiers and supported by treachery inside the Nawab's court. That single victory opened Bengal, the richest province of India, to systematic plunder. Within years, tax revenues were redirected not to local welfare, but to shareholders in London. The company didn't stop at Bengal. By 1803, it controlled Delhi. By the mid-19th century, nearly 60% of Indian territory was under company rule. Instead of merchants paying taxes, it was peasants paying to maintain corporate profit margins. Historian William Dalrymple calls it the world's first corporate coup. The result, Bengal's once thriving textile industry collapsed as British markets were flooded with machine-made cloth. Indian weavers, whose fine muslin was once called woven wind in Europe, faced destitution. A French traveler in the 18th century noted how their thumbs were deliberately cut off to prevent competition. A chilling story debated, but symbolic of brutal suppression. But if military force made the company rich, financial trickery made Britain richer still. The real fortune wasn't in taxes alone, it was in the invisible pipelines of gold, silver, and trade surpluses leaving Indian shores each year. And the shocking part is this: no navy was needed, no treasure fleets looted. The transfer happened silently, year after year. Britain drained $45 trillion from India without guns or ships. Where did all that money go? By the late 18th century, Britain didn't need to load treasure chests onto ships at Sword Point. The theft was built into the system. Taxes collected in India weren't spent locally. They were shipped to London as home charges. Every year, millions of pounds left Indian coffers to pay for the salaries of British officials, pensions, interest on debt, and even the costs of Britain's own wars. The trick was simple. India exported cotton, indigo, saltpeter, opium, and rice worth millions. Yet instead of payment in bullion, Britain issued bills and credit notes that never reached Indian hands. The profits landed straight in British banks. In 1835, economist Thomas Macaulay wrote to Parliament noting that the treasures of Hindustan were flowing endlessly toward London. By the early 20th century, London was the world's financial capital, its banks fattened on Indian surpluses. Historian Angus Madison's data shows how Britain's GDP rose sharply after the 1760s, while India's began its historic decline. Utsa Patnaik's modern study calculates the total drain at an astonishing $45 trillion. To put that into perspective, Britain's current economy is just around $3 trillion a year. So where did all this wealth go? It built the British railways, funded the Royal Navy, expanded colonial infrastructure across Africa and the Caribbean, and financed Britain's Industrial Revolution. While Manchester's mills ran on Indian cotton, the farmers in India who grew it faced crushing poverty and famine. What's striking is how invisible the loot remained. There were no gold-laden galleons. Instead, there were ledgers, credit instruments, and trade deficits. An economic siphon so efficient that millions in India didn't even realize their sweat was building empires abroad. But when Britain faced existential crises in the 20th century, they needed not just surpluses, but India's gold itself. Indian gold paid for Britain's world wars. But why did Indians get only debt and IOUs? When the First World War erupted in 1914, Britain's economy was already fragile. To finance its war machine, London leaned on India. The Raj extracted nearly £146 million from Indian revenues between 1914 and 1918. More shocking, India shipped over 1.3 million men to fight under the British flag. Yet back home, taxpayers footed the bill. But gold was the real prize. During the war, Indian reserves were systematically drained to back Britain's credit abroad. By 1919, India's gold and silver reserves had fallen drastically. Instead of repayment, Britain issued sterling balances, basically IOUs locked in London banks. By the end of World War II, those balances ballooned to £1.3 billion, yet India could barely touch its own money. Churchill's wartime policies made things worse. In 1943, while Britain drew grain and gold from India to sustain its war effort, Bengal starved. Over 3 million people died in the famine. Grain exports continued even as bodies lined the streets of Calcutta. Churchill dismissed the tragedy coldly, blaming Indians for breeding like rabbits. Meanwhile, Britain used Indian gold to purchase weapons from the U.S. through lend-lease arrangements, keeping its pound stable while India's economy spiraled. Indians were told their sacrifices were for freedom and victory. The truth? They inherited debt, inflation, and shattered industries. Britain walked away with global credit, and India was left counting corpses. By 1945, the war was won, but India's vaults were empty. The sterling balances remained frozen, and Britain delayed repayment for years. Independence came not with gold, but with poverty and scars of famine. And yet, despite this devastation, Britain's industrial boom had only accelerated. The great question remains: how much of that progress rested directly on India's ruin? Millions starved, while India exported food and wealth. Was famine a weapon of the empire? By the mid-19th century, something horrifying kept repeating itself. Crops failed, yet instead of relief, grain was exported. From 1876 to 1878, during the Great Madras Famine, India shipped record amounts of wheat to Britain, while between 6 and 10 million Indians died of starvation. British officials argued free trade could not be disrupted, even to save lives. The logic was cruel but calculated. Indian lives were expendable, but British markets could not be disturbed. In 1899 to 1900, another famine struck, this time killing over 1 million in central India. Grain continued flowing outward, guarded by colonial troops. Historian Mike Davis calls this late Victorian holocausts, pointing out that these famines were not acts of nature, but policies of empire. The deadliest came in 1943. Bengal's fertile fields should have fed millions. Yet exports of rice, jute, and grain to Britain drained supplies, while Japanese advances in Burma cut imports. Churchill refused to divert ships of Australian wheat to Bengal, claiming the famine is Indians' own fault. 3 million people perished in less than a year. Families sold children for a handful of rice. Entire villages disappeared. Famine wasn't random. It was structural. India's tax system, pricing controls, and trade routes were designed to prioritize London over local mouths. Between 1770 and 1947, more than 30 million Indians died in famines under British rule. Compare that to pre-colonial times, where regional famines occurred but were mitigated by local rulers' granaries and relief systems. This systematic hunger hollowed India's population while filling British warehouses. Every sack of rice that sailed out carried more than grain. It carried lives. And while the soil of India starved, across the seas, factories of England thundered into life, powered by resources and revenues extracted from these deaths. Britain's Industrial Revolution was fueled by India's loot. Should the stolen gold be returned? Britain's famous factories, the cotton mills of Manchester, the iron foundries of Birmingham, the railways that crisscrossed the nation did not emerge in isolation. Their lifeblood came from India. Raw cotton from Bengal and Gujarat fed Lancashire's spinning wheels. The capital to fund machinery came from Indian tax revenues. Even the coal-fueled expansion was bankrolled by profits siphoned from Indian trade. At the dawn of colonialism, India's textile industry was the envy of the world. Dhaka muslin was so fine it was called woven air. Yet British tariffs strangled Indian exports, while Lancashire cloth was dumped into Indian markets at artificially low prices. By 1830, millions of Indian weavers were jobless. Britain's Industrial Revolution thrived. India's artisanal economy collapsed. Railways are often cited as Britain's gift to India, but in reality they served imperial interests. Built with Indian taxes, railways carried cotton, wheat, and opium to ports for export. The guaranteed 5% returns promised to British investors meant Indians paid for infrastructure that looted them further. By 1900, India's debt to Britain had ballooned, while profits filled London banks. Consider this paradox. In 1750, India and China together accounted for 57% of global manufacturing output. By 1900, India's share had plummeted to just 2%. Britain's had soared. The shift wasn't innovation alone, it was extraction. So what does that mean today? Britain's museums still hold looted jewels like the Koh-i-Noor. Its economy, institutions, and global dominance were built on centuries of wealth transfer. India, meanwhile, entered independence impoverished, with literacy under 20% and life expectancy barely 32 years. The question hangs heavy. Can you repay trillions in stolen wealth, or is acknowledgement the only currency left? And that is where this story leaves us. With a theft so vast, its echoes still shape the world we live in. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed uncovering these hidden histories, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories the textbooks left out. Keep exploring with us. There's always another secret, another empire, another mystery waiting to be revealed.